Welcome to the 6th episode of Masters and Matches with me, Arne Moll.
And me, Peter Doggers.
Thessaloniki, ancient capital of Macedonia. A jewel of a city nestling in the warm bosom of the Aegean. Well, actually, to be brutally frank, it's more a sort of Hellenic Birmingham. The sparkling waters of the bay may look inviting, but they're so polluted if you went for a paddle, you'd probably lose both legs up to the knee. And as for the architecture, well, let's just say that the Prince of Wales isn't likely to take his next holiday here. None of this, however, was enough to deter your intrepid reporter from setting foot in the place last month. I'd come to witness a unique sporting occasion, the 28th Chess Olympiad.
This was an audio clip of the BBC documentary Grandmaster Clash, hosted by Stephen Fry, that was actually made about the 1988 Chess Olympiad. Mr. Fry traveled to Thessaloniki, Greece, and reported on the chess there, probably inspired by the fact that the English team had come second both in the 84 and 86 Chess Olympiads. And yeah, I can imagine the BBC was like, maybe they'll win it all together this time. Let's send a TV crew over there. So this documentary is available on YouTube. We will link to it in the show notes. And in the remainder of this podcast, we will also have a few more audio clips from that. Almost 40 years later, we figured that the 1988 Chess Olympiad is still a great topic for one of our podcast episodes. So Arne, let's talk about this Olympiad and why was it so special?
Yes, it was a special Olympiad because of the people who participated, because of the anecdotes that we are about to tell, but also because of this documentary, which was very revealing. So a couple of basic facts about this Olympiad. It was held from November 12th, 1988, by the way, my 15th birthday, until November the 30th. And during this Olympiad, there were two events worth mentioning as well. The first is that it was the 100th birthday of José Raúl Capablanca on the 19th of November. And on the 27th of November, the Dutch Grandmaster Hein Donner passed away. The Olympiad was held again in Thessaloniki, just like in 1984, because it was at the time the intention of FIDE, the Chess Federation, to hold the Olympiad every 4 years in Greece. Nothing came of that in the end, but that was at the time the big plan. Chess Olympiads always feature many countries, and in 1988 the geopolitical situation was a little bit different than it is right now. So, for example, East Germany participated in this Olympiad next to West Germany. It was a year before the wall in Berlin came down. So they were still two separate countries. By the way, East Germany beat West Germany by 3-1 during this Olympiad. And there were many other teams participating. The late 80s was the period when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. And one of the big questions for the chess world was if perestroika and glasnost, the two concepts that Gorbachev introduced, would lead to further popularization of chess in the Soviet Union, but potentially also outside of the Soviet Union. So can you say something about the format of this Olympiad, Peter?
Yes, absolutely. There were 107 teams from 106 different nations playing in what was a 14-round Swiss system tournament. This Swiss system is actually still quite common. Every 2 years in Olympiads we still use it, but it was not always the case. It was used for the first time in the 1976 Olympiad in Haifa, but before that, Olympiads always worked with preliminary rounds and playoffs. And well, the thing with Swiss tournaments, as we now know, happens quite a lot actually, is that teams can finish in a tie for first place, of course. And then the rule was to look at the Buchholz system, which is the added number of points scored by the opponents of the teams. And this became quite relevant in the Olympiad we're talking about today, but more about that later. Some other little things that are worth mentioning is that I think it was the first Olympiad that actually experimented with electronic boards. We went through the tournament bulletins that were produced every day, which, by the way, were very impressive. We went to the Max Euwe Center in Amsterdam. We researched this podcast, and all the tournament bulletins of this Olympiad were available. And I don't know, they just looked like complete magazines to me with games and interviews and photos. I don't think, I think it's been a while, let's say, that Olympiads were actually producing tournament bulletins in the first place. And they were very impressive.
Every round there was a separate magazine, and indeed it was like you had an entire magazine for just one round of games, and there were also very beautiful illustrations, interviews with famous players, background articles, truly amazing, and something which I don't think exists anymore.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and one of the articles in the bulletins was about a Greek company that was experimenting with digital boards, and they were kind of explaining to the chess players how this actually works, and that there were sensors in the wooden boards, and that it was the signals were sent to television screens. It's completely normal for us these days. It's been in use already for decades. But yeah, there was a moment where they did this for the first time, and I think it was the '88 Olympiad. And one other thing that we noticed from the bulletins was, of course, the incredibly long list of adjourned games, because we were still only a few years away from when FIDE terminated the adjournment of chess games. So we were still in a period when if a game lasted for, let's say, more than 4 hours, they would simply stop it. They would put the move in the envelope, the famous sealed move, and games would be played on a later day, maybe on the rest days. So all the time there were tournament standings, but also maybe a list of 30 games that still had to be finished. So yeah, these standings were always very unclear, and combined with this Buchholz system, I think it was a bit of a tricky thing to figure out who was doing well and who wasn't.
And I think the games were not finished before the next round started, or maybe even the round after that. So there was always a backlog of games that still needed to be finished. Very confusing.
Mm-hmm. So talking about '88, there were also some interesting things happening, let's say, from the perspective of the chess politics. This was also partly discussed in the aforementioned documentary, the BBC documentary. Arne, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, after the 1987 World Championship match in Sevilla, Kasparov was not very positive about FIDE. He even compared it to the mafia. And this had an effect on what happened during the 1988 Olympiad. He thought the Olympiads were amateuristic events, and therefore he remarked that they were actually in good hands with FIDE.
Yeah, it was the time that we had the Grandmaster Chess Association with Bessel Kok and Kasparov and Timman in the board, I believe, a period where a different organization was really trying to professionalize top-level chess, right? And that was very relevant for what was happening early in the Olympiad.
Yeah, FIDE was not very happy, and Campomanes, the FIDE president at the time, was referring to this in his opening speech during the Olympiad, during the first day of the Olympiad.
Tonight, on behalf of FIDE, I welcome you to the 28th Chess Olympiad.
He was quite open about how he felt about Kasparov and the Grandmaster Association, and he mentioned the following. He said, "The size of FIDE is not its only strength. The sum total of all the federations generate an incalculable and unchallengeable force over and above this sum total of its parts."
Yet there are ill winds that presume to challenge this force, ill winds that bring ships of piracy to the FIDE coastline.
"I am certain that we here gathered tonight shall tear these sails of ill wind, and the FIDE spirit shall, as it must, in the end, conquer over all." So Kasparov had called FIDE a mafia organization, and basically Kompomanes calls Kasparov a pirate.
Right, yeah. I understand that later, at the end of the Olympiad, there was also the traditional General Assembly, and these topics were going to be discussed. But the real hot potatoes somehow were postponed to the next General Assembly. So Kompomanes was quite fierce in his opening speech, and later on at the General Assembly, he somehow managed to postpone all these topics to the last moment, and then even didn't want to discuss them and moved it to a further meeting. So yeah, interesting times, and interesting to see how the vice president back then was dealing with these things.
Yeah, so we mentioned Kasparov already. Maybe you can say something about the top players who was participating. It was not only Kasparov, but also many other strong players, right?
Yeah, definitely. The easiest to check on this is to look at the final standings at the top three. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, Soviet Union won the Olympiad with 40.5 points. And the team consisted of Garry Kasparov, Anatoly Karpov, Artur Yusupov, Alexander Belyavsky, Jan Ilvest, and a very young Vasily Ivanchuk, who played in his first Olympiad that year. Second came England, who boasted on the boards Nigel Short, John Spielman, John Nunn, Murray Chandler, Jonathan Mestel, and William Watson. Surprisingly, and maybe secretly also one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast, the bronze medals went to the Dutch, to the Netherlands, John van der Wiel, Genna Sosonko, Paul van der Sterren, Jeroen Piquet, Rini Kuyf, and Rudy Douven.
And the strongest player was not even playing, right?
Exactly. Some of you might have asked, where is Jan Timman? Yeah, well, Jan, he always followed his own agenda, and he had played two very tough tournaments before the Olympiad, and he preferred to take some rest and prepare for his upcoming candidates match against Lajos Portić. So yeah, he wasn't there, and without Jan Timman, the team managed to score what is still the best performance of the Dutch team at an Olympiad. We should mention that the Dutch actually claimed silver at the Haifa 76 Olympiad as well. However, that was an Olympiad in Israel and boycotted by all the Eastern Bloc countries, so not as strong as usual. So I think this bronze medal was actually a better result.
Fantastic result.
So yeah, the Soviet Union first ahead of England and the Netherlands. And then let's check the full top 10. In fourth place, it was America. In fifth place, Hungary, which was a very strong country still. And the same could be said for Yugoslavia in sixth place. A surprisingly good result was scored by Philippines on seventh and China on eighth. And then there was Cuba and Argentina to complete the top 10.
Yeah, so China was not the powerhouse yet as it is right now.
They were not as strong yet, but still they were already competing. Cuba had been quite strong already for decades, so that was not really a surprise. And yeah, well, Soviet Union, they kept on winning Olympiad after Olympiad, of course, in those years, in those decades, you could say. This year it happened again, despite tensions between Kasparov and Karpov, actually, that were revealed in the aforementioned BBC documentary.
But between Karpov and me, it's a big difference. It's a conflict between the personality and the system. And Karpov, I deny that there is a Karpov-like personality, yes. It's a very strong, one of the best chess players in the world. This is true. But there is no Karpov as a person. It's a symbol of the system.
No, you see, I think this is not very correct. Of course you can say about yourself what you want. But I think you have no right to say about another person everything what you want. So this was not very nice, and the whole team is split now in two parts. But I think if we just play this Olympiad like individual competition, everybody on his own boat, then we can win easily.
Yes.
But if we consider this like a team competition, then it's a little bit difficult.
Okay, yes, I agree with Karpov. Just one additional remark, yes. Now we had 3 team meetings, just normal team meeting, and Karpov missed 2 of them. I think it explains something.
Apart from the dream team with Kasparov and Karpov, there were other big names as well in the Olympiad. You mentioned already Nigel Short, one of the strongest players in the world already, and Jonathan Spielman from the England team. And they had actually played a candidates match earlier that year, which Jonathan Spielman had surprisingly won. So in the documentary, Stephen Fry follows Nigel Short and Jonathan Spielman mainly, two players from the British team. He actually plays a game against Short. It's not a bad game. You can see it's played in the hotel room of Stephen Fry, I think. And it's an interview with Short in which they play a game during the interview. And you can see that Stephen Fry actually doesn't play all that bad, although he loses, of course. And what's also interesting from the documentary is Kasparov's comment on Short. He commented on the match between Short and Spielman, and he says that Short lost that match because he was way too self-confident. And he actually says he needs to change his personality if he wants to become a better player. So that's a very interesting insight, I think, and maybe something that more players should take to heart.
Also because, of course, from a historic perspective, 5 years later, they would actually face each other for the World Championship title of the newly founded Professional Chess Association.
Yeah, and maybe, Short had learned his lesson, I think, but not enough, probably. Another interesting moment in the documentary is when you see Jonathan Spielman dancing at the closing party.
You've almost certainly seen a polite English shop assistant. You may even have seen a pig playing tennis. But you will never, I can guarantee, have seen anything in your life quite like Jonathan Spielman dancing.
Stephen Fry thinks this is a very funny moment, but I think if you go to some of the parties at the Olympiad, you see weirder movements, right, of some players.
Oh yes. I've been to a few Bermuda parties. Bermuda parties always organized by Nigel Freeman from Bermuda, and yeah, I've seen some funny dancing myself as well. Yes.
Yeah. But let's mention a few other players as well. Lajos Portis and Ripley from Hungary. For Norway, we find a player which is still well known as well as the former coach of Magnus Carlsen, Simon Agdestein. And there were also some very strong players who played for countries that you might perhaps not expect immediately. Viktor Korchnoi, for example, he played for Switzerland, and Boris Spassky played for France. And then another well-known name from Eastern Germany was Wolfgang Ullmann. Yeah, so both England and the Netherlands played very strong throughout the tournament. In the end, England came second because they profited from the fact that their first round opponents, which were the Faroe Islands, scored 2.5 points more than Hong Kong, which was the opponent of the Dutch in the first round.
Yeah, this was this thing that I mentioned earlier, this Buchholz system, that that can really feel a little bit unjust sometimes, especially for the teams that just miss out on medals. But it still happens in Olympiads that sometimes things get decided by very early results or results among far lesser teams that were never close at the top. They were never closely playing at the top even. But their score is still relevant for the Buchholz of the top teams.
Yeah, there's a funny fragment in the BBC documentary where you see Jonathan Spielman calculating with sheets of paper what the final standing would be if certain results from the lower boards were taken into account. And he's not sure about the results at all. And it goes to show that even at the last minute, there could still be surprises as to who would win the medals.
As far as I can see, we've added 16.5 with two other adjournments, one of which is in favour of the people who we played and one of which is probably drawn. And they've added 14 with 4 adjournments, one of which is lost, 2 are won, and one is worse. So they will probably get 16.5, and we will get about 17 or 17.5. And since we had half a point in a lead to start with, unless my brain has totally seized up, which is quite likely, we're winning by about a point in this magnificent way of deciding such things.
One more thing I wanted to mention about the Dutch. Well, we'll talk about it soon more. But when asking how a team with a lot of young players, such as Jeroen Piquet, but also a team without Jan Timman, how on earth they could finish basically in a tie for second place behind the Soviet Union. The seasoned Russian grandmaster Genna Sosonko, who had emigrated to the Netherlands in the early 70s and was playing for the Dutch team and was basically the person that that brought the experience and the professionality into the team. He gave a nice explanation for the success in New in Chess magazine, while also pointing out something that is still sort of happening all the time in Olympiads these days, which is that the strong teams are always staying at good hotels at Olympiads. He wrote, "The strongest teams stayed in the Macedonia Palace in Thessaloniki, the best hotel in town. Although it must be said that even the suites of the two Ks, Kasparov and Karpov, consisted of only 2 little rooms without a fridge and with only a black and white television. 6 teams stayed in the Macedonia Palace: Russia, Hungary, Iceland, England, the United States and Holland. At one point, the Icelanders said that most of the laughter and gaiety was heard coming from the Dutch team's quarters. That, of course, was one of the main reasons for our good results. We were a real team. There were no cliques, no separate factions or camps, as in the case of so many other countries. Despite the differences in age, we got on great."
Unfortunately, it didn't all end very great for the Netherlands in the end, because they came third, not second. England actually took that place. And one of the crucial matches in this Olympiad was actually the match between the Netherlands and England. And there were some pretty dramatic moments in that match. I think the most dramatic one for sure was the game between John Nunn and Paul van der Sterren. Paul van der Sterren was still an international master at the time, and he had gained a completely winning position against John Nunn. Again, in the BBC documentary, you see fragments of that game while it is being played, and Short is commenting on the position, saying that it is completely lost for John Nunn. He says, "Just run with the A-pawn." Van der Sterren had a passed A-pawn, and it's over.
It was completely busted, actually. Absolutely gone. A5, A4.
But unfortunately, Van der Sterren did not run with the A-pawn. Instead, he liquidated into what he thought was a winning opposite bishop ending. But unfortunately for him, it was not winning. It was a draw. In fact, it was a theoretical draw. And that was a huge setback, not only for the Dutch team, but also for Paul van der Sterren himself. And he wrote about it in his book, Black on White, which is basically an exercise in therapy, if you ask me. He describes the pressure of a game such as this, in which he could, by the way, score a GM norm as well. This is what he experiences as mental vertigo, that's what he calls it. And he writes the following: "I experienced a moment of utter despair afterwards. But I'm not alone, and I'm immediately surrounded by immense sympathy, first from my teammates and later from many others. Rini Kuyf immediately pours me a glass of beer. Hans Beum, present as a journalist, offers comforting words. They all emphasize that we've achieved a historic success after all. To my surprise, no one is angry with me. Everyone seems more concerned about my mental health. Will Paul perhaps suffer lasting psychological damage from this match?"
Yeah, luckily that wasn't really the case. I believe actually not that long after this Olympiad, Van der Sterren started to score his well-deserved Grandmaster norms. And as we all know, and we actually talked about in the 4th episode about the Wijk aan Zee tournament, Paul van der Sterren would even make it to the candidates match against Garry Kasparov in 1993. So his things went all right in the end for him in his career, but this was a very tough moment.
And what about the match between the Netherlands and the Soviet Union? I think there was also some interesting shenanigans there, right?
Yeah, that is actually one of the most famous anecdotes of this Olympiad, I believe. It was even also told to me once, I think by the former Australian team captain, Manuel Weeks. We clearly immediately found it as well in newspaper articles and magazine reports on this Olympiad. Everywhere people were writing about it, so it was definitely a thing back then, which was the famous 2-2 between the Netherlands and the USSR. Not just because they tied against each other, but the way it happened was quite special. So Genna Sosonko had played a draw with Artur Yusupov, the first result in this match. And then he asked the team captain of the Dutch, Frans Kuipers, shall I offer them 2-2? And then, well, the team captain said that maybe it's not a bad idea and a bad result, but he was basically saying, I don't think they'll accept it. And then Gennaro Sosonko went to Sergei Makarichev, the Soviet grandmaster who was acting as the team captain back then. And he said, well, maybe ask Kasparov, see what he thinks. And Kasparov checked the positions on the last 3 boards, and he basically thought it was a good idea as well. But Kasparov said maybe also check with Karpov, who was, of course, also still playing his game. So they had to wait for a moment when Karpov was able to talk. And Karpov replied, the decision is up to you. And then Sosonko basically knew enough, and he started telling his Dutch teammates, stop the clocks. But the 3 Dutch players who were playing were actually... They didn't really dare to do that because, it was such an unusual thing to just simply stop clocks, right? Without maybe even draw overs, something like that. So then what happened is Sosonko simply went to the game between Baljavski and Piquet, and he himself stopped the clock, to Baljavski's great surprise. Whereupon Karpov said, well, then it's a draw. So, suddenly all games were finished, and the result was 2-2 in this match.
Wow.
Another anecdote is from the match between the USSR and America. So Soviet Union winning the Olympiads, America finishing in 4th place. When these 2 teams played against each other, the Soviets won narrowly, 2.5, 1.5. Something worth mentioning happened during that match. Arne, tell us about it.
Yeah, Yasser Seirawan describes an incident in his book, My Games with the World Champions. And it happened in his game against Garry Kasparov from that match. Actually, Seirawan played a good game. He was easily drawing, but he got into time trouble, and at some point the situation was not entirely clear anymore. And actually at some point he made a mistake, and Kasparov jumped on that occasion, really. And apparently there were already some tensions between the 2 players earlier in that game, Kasparov being very noisy and pushing the clock very hard. And when Seirawan made his mistake, Kasparov executed his move with a loud bang on the clock. And this incident is described by Seirawan. He writes the following. With his move, Garry lashed out and smashed the clock with a closed fist. Unfortunately, the table happened to have little give to it, and the end result was that all the pieces jumped off their squares. I was furious. Indeed, Garry had been so violent that on the adjacent board, the game between Karpov and Gulko was also disturbed by Garry's outburst, as their pieces jumped as well. So here I was, pieces sprawled about, my clock running, and now this. For the last few moves, Garry had been doing his piece-screwing business, and I had had enough. I decided right there and then that a solid right punch to the jaw was the required response, and I clenched my fist. Garry's sense of self-preservation kicked into higher gear faster than I could make my move. Garry put his hands in the air and kept saying, sorry, 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 repeatedly, all the while readjusting the pieces and putting them on their proper squares. Garry's sudden change to a fawning apology disarmed me. The rush of adrenaline that wanted me to put Kasparov in a different time zone had nowhere to go, and I found that it took me many minutes to restore my concentration.
Wow. But in the end, he didn't make it, right? He lost the game to Garry.
He lost the game to Garry, and they lost the match, and that was a very important victory for the Soviets.
Well, I think there's one more very big reason why the 1988 Chess Olympiad was a historic one, was a famous one, and that is for something that we haven't even talked about. That was the Women's Olympiad, and what happened there was quite magnificent and quite surprising. Arne, why don't you start taking this part of the story?
Yeah, so the Women's Olympiad was also a big event. There were 56 teams from 55 different nations, and there were 3 boards for every team. So not 4 like with the men, but 3. And there was a 4th substitute player. And the big sensation of the tournament was the Hungarian team. Because in the Hungarian team, 3 ladies participated that we all know. Zsuzsa Polgar, Sofia Polgar, and probably most famously Judit Polgar, who was still only 12 years old at the time. But there was also Ildiko Madl. She was a very strong player in her own right. And they, in the end, managed to overthrow the Soviet women. And the Soviet women had won 10 of the previous 11 Olympiads, except for the 1976 Haifa one, which they didn't participate. But this time, they lost their gold medal to the Hungarian teenage team. And definitely the biggest star of the team was Judit Polgar. She scored an amazing 12.5 points out of 13 games. And she also had the highest performance rating of her board, which was the second board. And the amazing thing is that the Soviet team was also very strong. So Maya Chiburdanidze was playing. She was the women's world champion at the time. Akhmilovskaya, Levitina and Litinskaya, they had a much higher average rating than the Hungarians. Actually, in the end, the bronze medal was won by the Yugoslavian ladies team, also very strong. But they were definitely overshadowed by the amazing performance of the Polgar sisters.
Yeah, and it was just like in the men's Olympiad. This was actually a very close affair where Hungary won with 33 points, only half more than the Soviet Union, that finished on 32.5. And there is actually a bit of a Dutch flavor in the story as well, because it was partly because the Soviet Union finished their Olympiad by playing 3 draws against the Dutch team.
Yes, it was super close, and I think actually all the odds were in favor of the Russians. If you look at the last round, it was tight between Hungary and the Soviet ladies, but the Soviet ladies had a much better draw. They played against the Dutch, who were relatively weak that year, and they were set to win. Whereas the Polgar sisters played against Sweden, and Zsuzsa Polgar was actually losing against Pia Kramling. So it looked very bad for the Hungarian team. But then things turned around. The Soviets drew all their games, and I think they were in the end quite lucky to not lose. And Zsuzsa managed to save her game against Pia Kramling, whereas Judit won and Madl played a draw. So that gave them half a point edge over the Soviet ladies, and in the end they won. But that was really quite unexpected, and you can only wonder what would have happened if things turned out differently and the Soviet ladies would have won.
As Judit Polgar wrote herself, when journalists first saw us in the press center, they thought that our participation might add some color to the general story. While the tournament was advancing, it was becoming clear that we were the story of the Olympiad. Well, that's them sure as well. And it is also interesting to see how at the time people were writing about the success of the Polgars, and particularly Judit, who was doing so well already at 12 years of age. And for example, Glenn Fleer, the English grandmaster, wrote in New in Chess about the Judit Polgar phenomenon. This does seem an appropriate moment to say a few words about the young star from Hungary. The results that she has recently achieved and her analytical strength are truly astonishing. And if she continues to improve, then she will start making serious waves in the male-dominated world of chess. I think the Polgars in general and Judit in particular prove that women can play chess and at the same level as men. Prophetic words by Mr. Fleer, I would say, because if anyone was able to compete alongside men, it was Judit.
Indeed.
Yeah, this wonderful breakthrough story of the Polgars, because they really became world famous after that. It is mentioned in the documentary, the BBC documentary, but more importantly perhaps, it is of course also mentioned in the recently launched documentary Queen of Chess about Judit Polgar, which can be viewed on Netflix. And I can recommend it. I've seen it and it's really wonderful. It's a beautiful story about Judit. But also in the first part of the documentary, of course, we also see her sisters and this success at the '88 Olympiad.
Yeah, and it's funny that Judit Polgar describes as well that it was the first time that Kasparov noticed her, and her sisters as well, I guess. And she describes a moment where she noticed Kasparov looking on at her board while she executed a beautiful combination against Chilingirova. And she later describes also that Kasparov walked with them towards the playing hall. He was mainly speaking to Shusha because Judit and Sofia were a little bit too intimidated to speak to Kasparov. But it was really the first moment when the Polgar sisters were noticed internationally. And I think it's great that Stephen Fry also captures that in his documentary, because it makes it a quite unique document.
The only players in the Olympiad who had attracted as much interest as the two Ks were three teenage sisters called Zsofia, Judit and Zsuzsa Polgar. Constituting, as they do, 3/4 of the Hungarian women's team, the Polgars are an authentic chess phenomenon. The girls, who are educated at home by their child psychologist parents, have all been expert chess players since the age of 3. Judit, who's still only 12, is the best player of her age, regardless of gender, in the whole of chess history.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and actually the documentary Queen of Chess kind of focuses for a big part on the rivalry between Polgar and Kasparov later in their careers. So yeah, it's nice how that started. And
yes, there are images that I think almost nobody has ever seen before, and really, well, I think it's really surprising to see how, for instance, Judith confidently sits behind the board. She's only 12 years old, but she looks very mature in her posture while she's defeating her opponents, and it's just great to see those old images. I think it's really it adds to the value of the documentary that they dug up all those old footage.
yeah, and I think that in the careers of the Polgars, this Olympiad was also quite important. Well, at least in the documentary, it was the message is brought that before this Olympiad, they could hardly travel outside of the country. Hungary, at that point being a communist country, of course, it's about a year before the Berlin Wall drops, and they're still living in communism, and the regime is not exactly enthusiastic about people being different, them having a different background, education at home, being homeschooled, trying to play chess tournaments among men. Everything is not very supported, and there's even a fragment where the parents of the Polgars reveal that at some point men with machine gun come to their house, and they are even threatening to take the children away.
Choosing for your kid to be homeschooled, being a girl playing with men, this was not supported at all by the communist government.
Unlike other girl players, we were often restricted to leave the Eastern Bloc. In the communist regime, when you don't do what you're being told, you'll pay, and potentially your whole family pays for it.
But then everything changes after their big success at this Olympiad, right?
Yes, I think it is Judith herself who calls the Olympiad life-changing for her and her sisters. And I think that's true, especially from a PR perspective. But I must say that when I read back some of the older reports on the Polgar sisters from those days, for instance, one of the books that I consulted was the book about the Polgar sisters that the Dutch journalist Ed van Eden wrote in 1990. I have a copy signed by all the three sisters, by the way. And he writes that already earlier in 1988, the Polgar sisters played in at least 2 international tournaments, the New York Open, which was in June 88, and then also in Iceland, in Reykjavik, and they scored pretty well in both tournaments. So they were definitely already able to travel. That is a nuance that I think is not there in the documentary.
So Judit Polgar's big achievement was actually on board 2. 12.5 out of 13 is still an amazing score. Of course, her older sister Zsuzsa, who was higher rated, was playing on board 1 in that Olympiad. But the gold medal for best performance in the women's Olympiad on the top board went to Pia Kramling. She scored 12.5 out of 14, so actually playing all rounds. And Pia, she was a very famous Swedish grandmaster. Already in the 1980s, she was an absolute top player in those days. And it's funny, but I think nowadays she's more famous for being the mother of Anna, right? Anna Kramling. Let's say a chess influencer, streamer, and also a decent player, by the way.
Yeah, times are changing.
Times are changing, yes.
So something else happened in the Women's Olympiad as well that had nothing to do with the Polgar sisters, but it was a quite spectacular event. Can you describe that, Peter?
Definitely, and it also was a little bit related perhaps to what happened in the final rounds of that Olympiad, where the Soviet Union was a little bit weakened compared to earlier in the event. Why? Because one of their players simply couldn't play the last few rounds anymore because she wasn't in the country anymore.
So what the hell happened there?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think it was on the eve before the second rest day that John Donaldson, who was the team captain of the American team and whom we actually interviewed in a previous episode of our podcast.
Coincidence.
Quite a coincidence. He was 31 at the time, and he secretly married the Soviet player Elena Akhmilovskaya. And then the next day, they jumped on a plane to Frankfurt, and from Frankfurt to Seattle. And basically, Akhmilovskaya defected from the Soviet Union by doing that. And the whole American team kept it a secret. It was not a complete secret anymore at some point. I believe initially they were simply planning to leave together at the end of the Olympiad, but too many people got wind of it, and therefore they took an earlier flight, which was I think with like 4 rounds to go or something. And I mean, the Americans were quite cheerful about this because it was actually just a story about love, right? And I remember a few Olympiads ago, there was also a wedding proposal during one of the rounds in the Olympiads. And this was, another one of those stories. It's also kind of funny that Maxim Dlugy, also in New in Chess, wrote about this, marriage incident, the marital gambit. I think kind of in a way, in the context of trying to explain, giving some reasons why the USA had failed to clinch a medal and only came fourth. He wrote, "Before the news came out into the open, the American team had to carry the weight of this secret, as the newlyweds definitely wanted to leave the country before the Soviets had a chance to react. Most of the team had only a couple of hours of sleep that night as they stayed up late discussing the exciting prospects emanating from our team captain's marriage and rose early to ensure a safe departure from Thessaloniki for the happy but worried couple. The excitement of this event definitely took a great deal of energy from the team members and influenced their play in the last 4 rounds of the Olympiad." So this should definitely have been seen as a bit of a weakening of the Soviet team because Akhmilovskaya was actually on 8.5 out of 9 by that point. She had only drawn 1 game and won all her other games. And another remarkable little detail, by the way, is that in the next day, in the match between the Netherlands and the USA, in the game between Gulko and Sosonko, the exact same moves were copied as that one draw that Akhmilovskaya had played, as if they were somehow giving tribute to her defection from the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's weird.
And speaking of special games, I think there's one very nice game from this Olympiad that should definitely be mentioned as well, right?
Yeah, please Google the game between Karsten Hoy and Gulko that won the Brilliancy Prize of the 1988 Olympiad. It's a fantastic game by the little-known player Hoy, but he completely demolished the great player Boris Gulko in a sacrificial game. It ended with a beautiful epaulette made with knights instead of pawns, actually. So really worth your time to review that game.
So all in all, a very interesting, maybe one of the more interesting chess Olympiads in history, with a lot of different storylines. And quite interesting to go back into history and go through it all one more time.
Yeah, Kasparov and Karpov in one team, the Polgar sisters, all 3 united in one team. Doesn't get any better than that.
Exactly. All right, well, thanks again for the episode. Hope you enjoyed this one, and see you next time.
See you next time.